The new, smaller size paper money. In July 10th, 1929, a new size of paper money was introduced to the United States. Up until this point, a much larger size of paper money was par for the course. Here is one single sample. I deliberately have lower grade specimens so that they're not very valuable, and so handling them is not like damaging something that might be actually valuable. But as you can see, we know how big these are. This is just the familiar size that we're used to. Then you get to this and you think, my goodness, this is huge. And one of the things I would have to wonder is, did people have wallets that were just bigger in those old days? Or maybe they just stuffed them in a pocket and folded them, maybe this way and then this way, as you can see from the fold marks on this one, or maybe even an additional time as well. So it's hard to say, but it's nice how you can see, especially in the case of the $1, the extraordinary continuity they managed to sustain, that even though the size is different, the patterns are surprisingly similar, strikingly similar. You could just see how all these little things here, silver certificate across the top, all the little lathe work and lace work and so forth. And they both say, this silver certificate, this certifies that there has been deposited in the Treasury of the United States of America, and it continues down here, $1 silver payable to the bearer on demand. So, again, you see the same lathe work, or just same look to everything. Same scroll work here. So sort of like a shell here and here, snail shell. This oval here and here. This other thing I always kind of felt like reminds me of like a clock or something. So, and you can even see that the language here, it's a little hard to read over this blue treasury seal, which you can see the basic part of it is exactly the same, except that the outer part here, you got this very fancy lathe work, flowery sort of scallop thing, and down here you just have these tiny little points. But they both still say, this certificate is receivable for all debts, for all public dues, and when so received, may be reissued. If we can make that out more clearly here. It's a little hard. Okay. And you can see they even, they have a serial number with letters at each end. They have plate location numbers, D, and more fancy looking D there, and again, another D with a number here, a more fancy looking D, and some other different number there. And then, let's see, what else do they have? They have a series year, which does not really coincide with when these are necessarily printed or come out, but when the design is officially approved and printing can start. So that would be 1928, but as I said, even if they could have started printing these things in 1928, they wanted to have a good supply of them on hand before releasing them on July 10, 1929. Before that was series of 1923. Okay. Now, the one, as you can see, they both have the same picture of George Washington, except that the older one, everything's a bit larger, except the picture. That just means you get a little more of his clothes than you do here. That's about it. But as you can see, otherwise, the design is surprisingly similar. Now, there is one other small difference, and it has to do with the natures of the signatures. In the old large size, in most cases, you would have on this side the Register of the Treasury, and on this side you would have the Treasurer of the United States. And going to the small size, in, again, most cases, you'd have the Treasurer of the United States on this side, and the Secretary of the Treasury on this side. So you actually got three different offices. You have the Register of the Treasury, the Treasurer of the United States, and the Secretary of the Treasury. So that's one small subtle difference between the two. And on the other side, as you can see once again, though there is the notable difference of this whole design that's replaced with just this $1 over 1, and one other small thing, which this had $1 and $1 on each side. This went to the United States of America. But at the bottom, it is just $1 here, $1 here. And in fact, the designs are once again virtually identical, other than the specific changes I've just pointed out. This keeps the smaller size dollar very familiar to those who have formerly handled the large size. Now bear in mind, this is a time where this $1 in its own heyday would probably have bought a week's worth of groceries or thereabouts. So that's actually a fair amount of money. You didn't usually have to deal with larger bills very much at all. But what was also interesting is if it's a silver certificate, it means that there's silver dollars, actual silver dollars. In fact, the silver certificate was created in 1878, the same year they started making those Morgan silver dollars as the backing, most of which remained in the Treasury. In point of fact, for every one of these certificates that was out there somewhere in the Treasury or in the banks, there's a silver dollar earmarked to that particular paper. If everybody took their silver certificates in, they could all get whatever silver dollars those certificates said. Everybody all at once. So this makes this pretty strong money when you think about it, as long as that policy is honored. Well, in going from this large size, which, by the way, sometimes retroactively got the nickname of horse blanket because, look at the size of this thing. It's huge. A horse could use it for a blanket. Well, not quite literally, but you get the idea. It's very large, and now we're getting smaller size, which, in a way, points the way to the future. Now, we can look briefly to the future here. These all came out in July 10 of 1929. In each case, the signatures are Tate and Mellon. 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 They're also all series 1928. Series 1928. Series 1928. Series 1928, if I can find it. There it is. And series 1928. So it kind of made sense to see how well that pointed to the future by looking at the other end of the 20th century, and in particular I've picked 1995 for reasons that will soon be clear. So the 1995, of course, that would be a $1. 1995 was pretty reasonable and predictable, but for these other years it gets a little more interesting. You'll see, however, of course, it has become a different kind. It's now a Federal Reserve note. There's no talk about silver or anything else. Instead of this whole long verbiage about being able to take this and receive it and pay it back out, now there's just this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. There's also a letter for which Federal Reserve Bank it is. You still, however, got Treasurer over here and Secretary of the Treasury over there. Signatures, a little bit of the scroll work, especially the stuff immediately surrounding the picture of George Washington, is still substantially the same. The picture is a little bit bigger, which means we lose a little bit more of what's at the bottom. And so the oval's a little bit wider than before, but essentially they are the same picture. You can see, though, that all the lacework around has been completely redone and is completely different. So instead of this oval, you've got this weird shape here and so on all the way around. Needless to say, the backside is also completely redone. In 1935, this design was replaced with this design. Yes, and this is what everybody has seen for so long that in time, this kind of retroactively acquired the name Funnyback, because if you're used to this all the time and you see one of these, you say, well, that looks kind of funny. Not that it's, humorous, but just kind of unusual. Funnyback. So sometimes they call it that. So that pointed the way there. Now the next denomination up was the $2. This was a different category of money, known as a United States note. Now this is actually very similar to the Federal Reserve, except who's controlling the money supply. All right, so Now this has a different verbiage. This note is a legal tender at its face value for all debts, public and private, except dues on exports and interest on the public debt. So that's kind of interesting. You couldn't pay the public debt with that, and you also couldn't do dues on imports. So that's kind of weird that you were kind of limited in that way. The verbiage also was something else. See here, the United States of America will pay to the bearer on demand $2. And there you have all this scroll work. And as it turns out, in 1995, after not making $2 bills very much, they stopped the United States note $2 bill in the 1960s. But in 1976, the $2 revived now as a Federal Reserve note. It's a one-shot thing. It would be Series 1976 to commemorate the bicentennial year. $2, 200 pennies, 200 years. See how that fits together. But the one really interesting and remarkable thing is that the scroll work is surprisingly similar. It's redrawn a bit. If you look carefully, you count a few more beads here than you would here, and similar changes around, because it's like it's been hand redrawn. But it is fundamentally similar scroll work all the way around. One other omission here is that where the old said, "will pay to the bearer on demand," that whole line has been replaced with this new little bit of scroll work. Perhaps we'll get into that later on. Now, the backs were somewhat more unusual because in this case, one can see that they used to have, well, since there's Jefferson on the front, and he's still on the front now, again, slightly larger, slightly less of him, same basic reasons, but it's obviously the same picture of the same president. You now have the Monticello, which was Jefferson's house. It tells you that, and it's got $2, and it's got all this particular look. Well, as you know, the new $2 have the Declaration of Independence, 1776. Well, that's what they were commemorating 200 years previous. So, of course, as a commemorative, but they've kept this ever since. So, again, these are completely redrawn. Okay. So, the next denomination up is a $5. Now, by picking 1995, I happened to get the very last year that these new monies still have the same basic old look as the old. There's some minor differences, a little extra line around here that you don't have here. That's actually macro printing, one of their little newer security measures. But basically, you can see that at least from 1928 until 1995, the scroll work for this is fundamentally similar. It's a Federal Reserve note. It was as originally introduced in 1928 and simply remains so to this day. In those early days, Federal Reserve notes were meant to be only larger amounts of money than they are now. The backs also have a very close similarity for the same reasons. They both show the Lincoln Memorial and surrounded by the same sort of scroll work, lace work, and so forth, lathe work, whatever. You can see the guy in there, and if you look carefully, despite how beat up, you can maybe just barely make him out in that. They have a little plate number there of some sort, and there's a plate number there. So they're very similar, once again. But obviously, there are also some differences. You can see how the Great Seal has gone from a larger one with this older classic design to a smaller one with a new design. You can see how they used to represent these banks with a number 9, and then you have instead an H, which just simply the numbers A through L correspond to 1 through 12. You still have the bank number echoed 4 places all around here, because 8 is the H letter, H is the 8th letter, and 9, well, that is 9. This would have been a letter I if they had a letter. As Lincoln, everything here is the same. The only one other big difference is that here, again, you got will pay to the bearer on demand. And so United States of America will pay to the bearer on demand $5, whereas now it's just United Staes of America, $5. Reason being, was in the old days, the paper was really not accepted as being itself money, but as a representative of money. It was slim, it was lightweight, it was flexible, and in many ways, therefore, more practical than lugging around 5 silver dollars. So that made it easy. Of course, it also meant that they could print more of these and there was money to back it up. That is, of course, the big distinction between a Federal Reserve note and a, for example, silver certificate, where every silver certificate corresponds to a silver dollar, or at least $1 worth of silver, as one we'll see later on, to back it up. So that, at least, is a fairly close prediction of at least most of the 20th century for $5 bills. The same goes for $10 bills. Again, you see the same similarities. Again, you have a number, now you have a letter. You've got this will pay to the bearer, which goes away. You got the same kinds of signatures, different names, obviously, by now. But as you can see, the lace work, the scroll work is all exactly the same. Well, in those days, they would have it says Washington, D.C. They moved it up from down here. Series of 1928. One other thing that's kind of interesting here is the obligation. It says, redeemable in gold on demand at the United States Treasury or in gold or lawful money at any Federal Reserve Bank. So sometimes they call these old Series 1928 and all the letters A, B, C, or D up to that far, poor man gold certificates, because they are exchangeable for gold, but that is not to imply that they have enough gold or anything else on hand to redeem all of these all at once. If everybody brought these in, there'd be a run on the bank, and they wouldn't have enough gold. They don't need to. Federal Reserve notes, though, were still indirectly backed by that gold, in that as long as we can presume that a vast majority will just be used as notes and not get redeemed, the small handful of instances where somebody will want the gold, we can handle that. So, and the back of it, as you can see, also has not significantly changed, beyond the one slight but obvious change that we now have got "In God We Trust," whereas before they didn't have that. We can get into that in more detail in a later installment. So, once again, for the $10, that was a fairly good prediction of the future, and for the 20, again, $20 looks very similar. And it's got Jackson in the same relatively small bit. United States of America, the same kind of scroll work up there. They're Federal Reserve notes. They're $20. Again, this will pay to the bearer on demand, and here it's just $20. The back. Now here you actually notice a couple of differences. Of course, we've got the "In God We Trust" that the original didn't have. But another difference is, if you look closely at the White House and the foliage around it, as distinct from here, where they've got a little bit more foliage around it and so forth. Reason being is that they thought they'd try to get a more up-to-date picture of this later on. So that actually, and they also changed this from simply White House to the White House. So anyway, that's the introduction of small size. I find it interesting that all these denominations are the three most basic and common ones that will be seen. But that's only 3 out of 6 kinds of money that were still being used in 1929. And by the end of that year, or early the very next year at the latest, all 6 kind of monies still in use in 1929 will also have made their appearance in the small size. More about that next installment.